Welcome. We are continuing our series on Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and the history of blackmail operations in the United States. The last video was an introduction, and this one is about Samuel Bronfman and the mob. The Prohibition era in the United States is often used as an example of how banning recreational substances not only increases their popularity, but also causes a boom in criminal activity. Indeed, it was Prohibition that greatly increased the strength of the American Mafia, as the top crime lords of the day grew rich through the clandestine sale and trade of alcohol, in addition to gambling and other activities. It is through the bootlegging trade of the 1920s and the early 1930s that this story begins, as it brought together key figures whose successors and affiliates would eventually create a series of blackmail and sex trafficking rings that would give rise to the likes of Jeffrey Epstein, the Lolita Express, and Orgy Island. Samuel Bronfman never planned to become a major producer of liquor, but true to his family's last name, which means brandy man in Yiddish, he eventually began distributing alcohol as an extension of his family's hotel business. During Canada's Prohibition period, which was briefer than and preceded that of its southern neighbor, the Bronfman family business used loopholes to skirt the law and find technically legal ways to sell alcohol in the hotels and stores the family owned. The family relied on its connections with members of the American Mafia to illegally smuggle alcohol from the United States. Soon after Prohibition ended in Canada, it began in the United States, and by the time the flow of illegal alcohol had turned the other way, the Bronfmans, whose business ventures were then being led by Sam Bronfman and his brothers, were relatively late to an already flourishing bootlegging trade. We were late starters in the two most lucrative markets, on the high seas and across the Detroit River. What came out of the border trade in Saskatchewan was insignificant by comparison, Bronfman once told Canadian journalist Terence Robertson, who was then writing a biography of Bronfman. Nonetheless, this was when we started to make our real money, Bronfman recounted. Robertson's biography on Bronfman was never published, as he died under mysterious circumstances, soon after warning his colleagues that he had uncovered unsavory information about the Bronfman family. Key to Bronfman's success during American Prohibition were the ties his family had cultivated with organized crime during Canada's Prohibition, ties that led many prominent members of the mob in the United States to favor Bronfman as a business partner. Bronfman liquor was purchased in massive quantities by many crime lords who still live on in American legend, including Charles Lucky Luciano, Mo Dalitz, Abner Longy Zwillman, and Meyer Lansky. Most of Bronfman's mob associates during Prohibition were members of what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, which a 1950s Senate investigative body known as the Kefauver Committee described as a confederation dominated by Italian-American and Jewish-American mobs. During that investigation, some of the biggest names in the American Mafia named Bronfman as a central figure in their bootlegging operations. The widow of notorious American mob boss Meyer Lansky even recounted how Bronfman had thrown lavish dinner parties for her husband. Years later, Samuel Bronfman's children and grandchildren, their families' ties to the criminal world intact, would go on to associate closely with Leslie Wexner, allegedly the source of much of Epstein's mysterious wealth, and other mob-linked philanthropists, and some would even manage their own sexual blackmail operations, including the recently busted blackmail-based sex cult NXIVM. The later generations of the Bronfman family, particularly Samuel Bronfman's sons Edgar and Charles, will be discussed in greater detail in Part 2 of this report. This has been from a report by Whitney Webb in Mint Press News. Next up, we will be discussing Louis Rosenstiel.